regular at our conferences, actually, as has Alan been. Elaine Scarry is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics at Harvard, author of Thermonuclear Monarchy, kind of a Bible of the nuclear disarmament, one of the key tomes of the nuclear disarmament movement. And Elaine has been a leading voice in the nation for the need to pull a country back from its first use policies. So Elaine, please take the floor.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Aristotle said that a just country, a just government, is a country and government that inspires its population to be just, inspires its population to be good. And I think listening to Alan Roebuck, we can ask ourselves the question, can a country that has a genocidal nuclear architecture, an architecture that stands ready to bring about genocide, can that inspire our population to be large-minded and generous and to care about social problems? I think it can't. The nuclear architecture, as we also saw in Alan's talk, is extremely complicated. 13,000 missiles still exist. 94% of them are owned by Russia and the United States. We still have the policy of deterrence, despite the fact that deterrence, which was incoherent when it was only descriptive of 2 nations, is now trying to accommodate 9 nations pointing missiles at one another. And we know that even if the fraction of the arsenal were used, a huge number of missiles would remain. For example, the New York Times calculated that were the United States to decimate, and that was the word they used, were the United States to decimate the populations of 5 other countries, including Russia and China, and Syria and Iraq, it would have 70% of its missiles still left over. So the nuclear architecture is extremely complicated, and yet at its heart, it is also quite simple. And I'm going to try and illustrate its simplicity by reminding us that nuclear weapons, like any weapon, like a gun, like a knife, has 2 ends. It has the end at which a great deal of injury occurs, and it has the end at which someone fires the weapon or uses the knife to hurt someone. So it has a site of injury and a site of infliction. And the obscenity of nuclear weapons is graspable at both ends. It's graspable at the injury end, as we've just heard from Alan Roebuck's talk, by the huge scale of injury to the population. Even if less than 1% of the arsenal, world arsenal is used, we know that millions will die on the first afternoon and roughly 1 billion in the first month, from Alan's work by Alan and his colleagues. The injury is also going to be to the Earth itself. It eliminates from all people on Earth the capacity for self-defense, which is the basis of all other human rights. It also eliminates our ability to aid one another. It eliminates mutual aid, as we know from the International Red Cross, which says that if even a single city is hit, the worldwide capacity of Red Cross will not be able to help. So no one, I think we're mindful, and we've become even more acutely mindful through the nuclear winter work, of the scale of the injury. But what happens at the infliction end is equally obscene and equally extraordinary, in that all that injury is brought about by a single person, or at most in some countries, something like 3 people or 12 people. In most weapons, there's basically a framing ratio between the number of people who are using the weapon and the number hurt. 1 person fires the rifle, 1 person is shot. Or if they're a really good marksman, or it's a weapon with increased capacity, there may be 1 person firing and 20 shot at a time. But with nuclear weapons, you literally have 1 person issuing a launch instruction that, as Bruce Blair reminds us, is half the length of a tweet. And the result on this end is this massive amount of injury. In the Trump presidency, people in the United States and all over the world became aware of this architecture that depends on sole authority of a president or prime minister and the obscenity of it. And people had, understandably, a huge amount of worry about President Trump. However, it would be a fatal error for the population to think that this is somehow unique to Trump. It simply isn't. We know that President Eisenhower twice considered using atomic weapons, first in the Taiwan Straits in 1954, and a second time in 1959 in Berlin. We know from Robert McNamara that during President Kennedy's administration, he 3 times came within what McNamara describes as a hairbreadth of all-out nuclear war. President Nixon has told us that 4 times during his administration, he considered using a nuclear weapon. And that wasn't just a stray thought in his mind. For example, at one point, he sent 18 B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons over the continent of Russia. We know that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, considered using a nuclear weapon against China to prevent China from getting its first nuclear weapon. The record stops there because presidents, unlike Congress, are not transparent about their conversations. And we only find out 30 years after the fact when we go to the presidential libraries about these near misses that took place. We need to begin to ask our former presidents, our former living presidents, such as President Carter, President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush, exactly what they contemplated during their time in office. So the stress on the fact that a weapon has 2 ends is important for a second reason, and that is that international law, such as the ban that just came into force yesterday, international law stresses the illegality of the scale of injury that's happening at this end of the weapon. It says you can't commit suicide. You can't, genocide. You can't have weapons that cause disproportionate suffering. You can't have weapons that pass over the border into neutral countries. And we saw that in all those images of smoke, the way the smoke goes over the territory of every country. National law, in contrast, focuses on this end of the weapon and says you can't have sole authority for bringing about massive injury to a foreign population. Literally, that's what the US Constitution says. So that those people calling out to us from the international ban, people on every continent, people in Asia, like the people of Cambodia and Vietnam that signed that ban, the people of Europe, such as the people in Ireland and Austria that signed that ban, the people in Africa, such as the people of Ghana and Nigeria and the Congo Republic and South Africa that signed that ban, the people of Central and South America that signed that ban, Mexico, Peru, and others, are calling out to us, to the nuclear states, to make their weapons illegal. And we say, but it's not yet ratified in our country. But we have right within our country the laws, the Constitution that can be brought to bear on dismantling this architecture. Our Constitution requires that we don't go to war unless a huge assembly of people, namely our legislature, our Senate and House, 535 people, debate it and persuade one another that there are reasons to injure that foreign population. And the legislation such as the crucial Markey-Liu bill, which restricts presidential sole authority unless Congress has authorized it, and which has had in the last Congress 62 co-sponsors in the House and 13 co-sponsors in the Senate. And again, the Warren-Smith bill that had 52 sponsors in the House and 7 in the Senate. Both of those are based on the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war. That requirement for a declaration of war does not just occur in the US Constitution. It occurs in Article 35 in France Constitution. It occurs in Article 246 in the Indian Constitution. It occurs in Article 102 in the Russian Constitution. And there's a reason why it turns up in all these constitutions. And the reason is that it is not just a single phrase in the Constitution. It is what the Constitution is. It is what the Constitution is. Because if you go back to constitutional theory, to social contract theory, you find that that's what the social contract was. Thomas Hobbes, in the great work of social contract called the Leviathan, over and over again says, the point of the social contract is getting us out of the miserable condition of war. The point of the social contract is getting us out of the miserable condition of war. In an ideal world, we'd have a constitution, and France and India and Russia would have constitutions that made it illegal ever to go to war. But it's hard for states in practice to conform to theory, ideal theory. And so constitutions do the second best thing. They don't outlaw war. They instead say, we're going to make war very, very difficult, because we're going to make it that you have to get the largest body in your government, the legislature, to persuade each other that there are reasons to go to war. And we're going to have a lot of debate. And in the breakout session, I can explain how this works so magnificently. It's actually a quite thrilling invention. So again, ideally, constitutions would say, look, it's illegal to slaughter a foreign population and to put your own population at risk of being slaughtered. It instead does the second best thing. It says, we're going to make it very, very hard to go to war. Nuclear weapons are designed to make it easy to go to war. Let's make this easy. Let's put 1/3 of our warheads on alert, which they are right now, so that we'll only use a few seconds when we want to slaughter a foreign population, rather than having to mumble around for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Let's make this easy. Let's keep the nuclear football within an arm's reach of the president at all time. Why make him have to delay 10 minutes or 40 minutes and before he shoots the thing? We know from the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Hugh Shelton, who wrote an autobiography, that the Pentagon and Shelton personally practiced day and night transmitting the nuclear launch order from the president to the various missiles and submarines we have ready to make that launch. Hugh Shelton said, our philosophy was and continues to be practice, then practice again. Practice, then practice again. That's what the Pentagon is doing day and night. So too, a sailor on one of our Ohio-class submarines reports that out of the 90 days that each team on one of those nuclear submarines is at sea, there's only one day when they're not practicing to carry out a presidential launch order. And one might think that carrying out the presidential launch order is one of their pieces of work. No. Carrying out the presidential launch order is their work. That is their job. That's what they're there to do. It shouldn't surprise any of us that in the nuclear age, we've jettisoned our Constitution and the constitutional requirement to make it hard to go to war, not only for nuclear war, but for conventional war. We didn't have a congressional declaration in Korea War, in the Vietnam War, in the Iraq War, in the Afghanistan War, because presidents feel, I can commit genocide in the next 25 minutes, as President Nixon said. He said, I can go into the next room, pick up the phone, and in 25 minutes, 70 million people are dead. Why would a president feel he has to go through this cumbersome procedure merely to invade Haiti or Panama or the former Yugoslavia? Let's make this easy. Getting rid, well, presidential first use is a horrifying obscenity. That's the bad news. The good news is we have the tool. that can dismantle presidential first use. And there's more good news, and that is that presidential first use is the Achilles heel of the entire nuclear architecture. It's the Achilles heel because it's so obvious that it's obscene. It's the Achilles heel because it's so obvious that it's illegal. And it's also the Achilles heel because once one changes that, and I will try and speak about this more in this afternoon's breakout session, once you eliminate that provision, the whole nuclear architecture begins to unravel. It introduces a kind of spiral fracture into the whole architecture. And that's why we should all work together to get this legislation based on this constitutional provision passed as quickly as possible. I'll stop now, but just say one quick thing, and that is that Thomas Hobbes, the writer of the social contract theory, said that the worst thing that could ever happen to a population would be the massacre of its citizenry. And he says, if that were to happen, it couldn't happen in an aristocracy, it couldn't happen in an oligarchy, it couldn't happen in a democracy, it couldn't happen in a monarchy. It could only happen if there had ceased to be any governance at all. And I think we should conclude that a nuclear state is a state that has ceased to have any comprehensible government. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for that clarity and for pointing the way forward, that there is a way forward. I just want to mention that to all of you who are on this session, that the group of organizations that organized this event, we're almost certainly going to follow up in the late spring with a conference on no first use, with the notion of contributing to launching or developing a national campaign on no first use. And we'll talk more about that later in this conference.